Hey everybody, and welcome back to Wednesdays with Watson. By now you know that my name is Amy Watson and I am your host, and this is our first season, our inaugural season of the podcast that we have called PTSD, Jesus, and Me. This is a story of my journey, my diagnosis, and my healing even today, so that we can provide hope for those of you out there who are suffering from PTSD or love someone who is. I continue to focus on the star of my story, which is none other than Jesus, and the way that he has provided for me, and the 3 C's, and my community, obviously my church, and trauma-informed counseling. Today we're going to focus a little bit more on that community portion of it as we sneak back into a conversation that Crissy and I had over the course of about 2 hours. We've named these episodes Memory Keepers because one of the hallmarks of PTSD is the inability to remember things clearly, congruently, concisely, and sometimes correctly. And so, welcome as we join back into the conversation that Crissy and I had where we left off last week as Chris was explaining some of the more difficult portions of loving someone with PTSD and the necessity to do some hard things, including seek help yourself as the person who is in support of the patient. So sit back, relax, and sneak into this conversation with Crissy and me. If at all you could articulate, why me? Why did you choose me? Why?
I think that at this point you recognize that the Lord gives me some instincts.
100%.
And I can't say that it's me at all. It's only the Lord. So there's no sense in bragging on it other than to say he's given me a gift of instincts. And I just knew. That's really all I can say. Sometimes there's just that instinct. And I felt like that's exactly how our whole family was. I don't remember anybody talking about, hey, Amy should be part of the family. It was just, she's just part of the family. There was never a conversation. It just happened. And I think that all of us just felt that rightness and that this was part of the Lord's story. You just naturally fit in. And that's so highly unique and improbable and all of those words. It could only be the Lord. And
now some of those people would pick me over you.
Yes. Yes.
On any given day. I do agree that you've got that gift of instinct, but I know that, what's so precious to me about this and about Cheryl and about Chris. Now, you and Cheryl were new, right? So y'all come onto the scene in my heart and this part of my story, probably more prevalently than people who had already been on the scene. But it feels like, even talking about it 12 years later, it feels like the biggest hug from Jesus. Like, you know what? I got you. And I'm going to use the church and I'm going to use the community and they're going to be the body. As I mentioned in the last podcast, I moved back to Clearwater where I went to college and I didn't have a family. And so I it'd be one of the first things I'm going to ask Jesus after, that Mercy Me song. I can promise you one thing I will say is, why me? I don't feel worthy of this family, of this love, and of this unconditional friend who has been through so much with me. And so it's a good transition for us because perhaps one of the most traumatic things for all of us involved, you, me, and Cheryl combined, is that admission to the psych ward. Yes. And so I had only lived with you for about 3 weeks at the time. 14 days. Back to the memory issues. I had only lived with you for a few weeks. Did you notice anything different during that time that I lived with you, those 2 weeks from the time when we were friends that summer?
Yes. So when you moved in, one of the first things that I had noticed that I would come over and just in the morning say, hey, how are you and everything. And you would say, I'm having flashbacks at night. And I really was like, I'm sorry. I didn't know what a flashback was other than I thought basically what I heard is I'm having nightmares,
Right.
which was like, oh, okay, well, me too. And then the only other thing that I very specifically remember you saying is some days it's hard just to get dressed and get ready for school. And you don't tend toward the depression. And so that was unusual. And that was probably the actual only warning flag I had, because again, I thought flashback meant nightmare. So to some degree, I pushed that to the side.
Right.
The only clue I had was that I was like, well, is she tired? Is she struggling? That was it. And it was like 2 days later that you were in the hospital. So you did have one counseling session, as you mentioned, with Dr. Pettit prior to being hospitalized. And I do remember you coming to me after that first session and saying that he said it would get worse, way worse, before it got better. And one of the reasons I remember that is because I was shocked. I had no idea.
You thought counseling was going to fix it all.
Yes. I thought that, like having surgery, the healing would immediately begin. And once you got the antibiotic or whatever, that this counseling, once you started going, life would get good. And not just good, great.
Right.
It would all get better. And that it would get worse was so...
So you started the 3-month countdown at that point. Like
Right.
she's my mom was right. She only needs
3 months. So, but that was a Friday, and on Wednesday you were in the hospital. So it was that fast.
So let's set this up for a second. I posted a picture on my Facebook page of Cheryl and me, which ironically we didn't have any. So she brings, my memory is, I'm pretty sure this part is right. I went down and talked to Aaron, the assistant principal, and he brought Cheryl. She shows up with me to get some clothes before they take me to the hospital. And tell us what she said to you.
She pulled me aside and said, "Did you know?" And there were a lot of things going through my head. One was, of course I didn't know. If I knew, I would have told somebody. But the real thought was, oh man, should I have? Am I stupid for not knowing? And so for other people who are living with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, or even if your friend is in a domestic violence situation and you didn't know,
it's okay.
It's okay. Don't feel stupid. The key is let's move forward and help one another. But I felt so dumb that I didn't know. I had no clue.
Well, and you're a fixer, and so
I'm a fixer, but more importantly, I cared. And I couldn't believe I didn't see any warning flags, and I didn't. I didn't see one.
We didn't know each other. I mean, we had known each other for about. But
it's really, honestly, there have been times over the years that I've known you for years, and there were things there are times you just don't know. And it's okay to just miss the clues.
Right.
Sometimes we're just going to miss the clues, and that's okay.
And again, why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Because we want people to know, we want you to at least ask the question internally. And because while we're all born evil, I do believe there are more good people in this world than bad in terms of wanting to help like you did. And so there are some of you out there are going to be listening, and the chances of you coming upon somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder is going to be high. Yeah. And everybody's going to operate differently. You are called to a very specific part of my life. Yes. Now, you came to see me every day in the hospital, and that was interesting.
Yes, the hospital was, it was hard.
Talk to us about that a little bit. Some of this I'll hear for the first time.
When I would come in there, it was just hard. But it was about the fifth day. And I knew they had said all you had to do was eat. And I said, go eat. And they'll let you out of here. And they did. And that was the day you came home. And again, being the rainbows and butterflies, I was like, well, we've been to the hospital. It's all going to be good from here. Yes. Yeah. One of the things that has been coming to mind for me in community is it's not just the person with PTSD who is going to be traumatized.
Amen.
So I equate it to if you're a parent and your child is raped, the child is clearly the one who has been traumatized. Right. But as a parent, you're traumatized too. So recognize that.
And get your own help.
Get help. One of the things that has been so helpful for us is that we did have the same counselor.
Right.
If that isn't possible, at the very least, I would recommend that you do some joint sessions so that you can discuss and understand what are some things you can do to communicate better, to understand the situation.
So far, none of my memories have been lies or inaccurate or made up or any of those things, as is sort of somewhat common, particularly in younger kids. They'll remember it differently, and it really sometimes just never happened. So the last podcast I talked about going and filing for a domestic violence order of protection and leaving at sunset and driving over a bridge. Just because everybody can use a laugh, why don't you tell us what I did in that situation?
When we left the hospital on day 5, it was not sunset. There was no bridge.
I think she's wrong on that, guys.
No, it's absolutely correct, because I know where the hospital is. There are no bridges. We drove home in traffic. And it's not a pretty part of town necessarily. It's just.
So what do you suppose I'm remembering there?
I think that your memory wants to paint some positive to what is a hard memory.
Wow, that's
so
powerful.
Putting it at sunset over a bridge as I'm telling you the very hard news is your brain's way of saying, here's some hope in some very horrible news. I was supposed to keep a secret from you. It did not work out.
So let's talk about what's secret for those of you that might need to go backwards. And so on day 5, when we finally decided that if I ate, they'd let me out of the hospital. And by the way, this is a good place for me to tell you that oftentimes eating disorders are also the byproduct of post-traumatic stress disorder, something that I still struggle with today. And so when they let me out on day 5, you had some information along with Cheryl and Michelle.
And I had reached out to them.
So
you had
I'd gotten some emails. So yes. tell us how you found those emails. And
well, while you were hospitalized, you didn't have any electronics.
Right.
And so you had said, can you just keep an eye on my emails and make sure that I'm not missing anything major? As I did that, I got those emails.
And so the emails that she's referring to is I had been divorced for about 18 months. And they were awful emails.
Yes, they were systematically more and more threats. So I reached out to Cheryl and Michelle and said, okay, what do I do? And the first thing they said is, okay, well, Amy's in the hospital. So the only thing we would say for sure is
don't tell her.
Don't tell her the second she gets out of the hospital. At least give her a chance to get home and get settled. And I mean, this has already been traumatizing enough for her. And I was like, absolutely. Good point. I will not tell her immediately. I'll let her get home and get settled and sleep and eat and just sort of get settled in and feel, okay, we left the hospital.
We crossed the bridge at sunset when we left the hospital.
Right. Yes. The fake bridge and the non-sunset. As soon as we left,
it was pouring down rain and we were on the mainland.
So it's not 2.5 minutes later, and Amy looks at me and goes, okay, what's wrong? Because I have zero poker face, and Amy, who is just coming out of the hospital and they've probably given you a handful of drugs already.
Oh, for sure.
Already recognized.
For the ride home, dude, over the bridge.
With my horrible poker face. Even Amy could tell that I was holding something back. And of course, then I just blurted out, and John sent you these threatening emails. So I was not able to keep the secret from you. It was not that day that we went to the courthouse.
It was the next day.
It was the next day.
Jumbled memories, right?
Memories.
Now, it doesn't help that John Watson gave us plenty of memories
to get mixed up.
To combine. So the next one we go home,
right?
And I'm not sure if I sleep that night or not. I don't remember.
Yes.
We knew that we had to go file for a restraining order the next day. And I've also had to do that 3 times. And so in the last podcast, I combined some memories.
Yes.
One of the things, and I want to make sure that this is an accurate description, that I do remember about that first time in Pinellas County, so in Clearwater, not where we live now, they made me fill out paperwork. And in that paperwork, from childhood to that day, I had to tell them every time I had been sexually abused, physically abused, and then certainly there was a whole other sheet where I had to talk about the marital abuse. And I remember that stack of paper being fairly thick. The thing I remember being the most traumatizing about that is they wanted me to document every hit, every punch from John.
Yes. That part I do remember specifically because it took a lot of time and it was very difficult. And you did have to be very specific. And it was important for the case that you trudge through and do it diligently. And so I sat there with you and continued to prod you. Hey, you got to tell. Is that every time? You have to keep telling more stories. And that was very hard.
Yeah, because there were words that I had to use on that paperwork, like rape, that you don't anticipate in writing in context of a marriage.
Correct.
And so I remember leaving there fairly traumatized.
Again. After having just been in the hospital.
After just been in the hospital.
Very, very hard. Yes.
And then about that time is when I received the phone call from David Kilgore, who said, hey, teachers have decided to give you enough time so you can take another 30 days off. Yes. And then this was the October that my car insurance went up exponentially because I had 3 car accidents. Yes. Am I remembering that properly?
That is correct. Okay. Now the paperwork that we filed, that's all correct. But the person who was rude was not there.
I blamed the wrong person. That was another time when I had to file.
Another time and a different person.
So this person was pretty nice.
It's a different process there. And so I do not remember a person at all. I just remember handing in the paperwork.
And then we went away for a couple hours and they came back and I was granted the restraining order and a court date.
Temporarily.
Yes. The temporary restraining order and a court date.
Yes.
Which, of course, the court date, for those of you who are listening who may have experienced domestic violence, that's traumatic all in itself. Mm-hmm. And so about that time, after filling out that paperwork and them making me effectively write with my hand and my memory every time over 12 years that I had been hit, knocked, punched out, and all of those things was incredibly traumatic. So I go into 30 days of intensive outpatient therapy. I have 3 car accidents, and now is the time when I would normally tell the listeners about the court date. We went to court. So we went to court, and it was you and me and Chris DeWitt and Michelle and Mama Bootsy. I think that was all that was there. We filled up pretty much a whole bench, and we walked in, and again, this lady walked up to me and said, hey, I'm an advocate. Do you have any questions? And I didn't feel real supported by her at all.
I didn't think we needed support.
No, we didn't know what we were doing. You know?
I mean, it felt like cut and dry. He threatened your life.
Yeah.
I win.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. It felt like, why am I even here?
Right.
Can I not just phone this thing in?
Yes.
They didn't let us phone it in.
Right.
That time anyway. No. And so we went to court. We didn't know that they go by it. First of all, the people with attorneys get heard by the judge, and then they go through the alphabet. So we're sitting there, and of course, John at the time is living in St. Augustine. And so every minute that goes by that he doesn't come in, we're like, this one's in the bag. This is a slam dunk. He's a wuss. He's all bark, no bite. He's not going to show up. We're good. And had my name been Adams, that might be the case. Because we were sitting in that bench, and I will never forget hearing those court doors open. And I looked back and saw him for the first time since I left him. I have a lapse of memory at that point, which you can fill in a minute. I remember just being like, it was a seriously old crap moment. And then it was my turn to go up and I couldn't hear the judge. And so he was way far from me and I couldn't hear him. Michelle went with me, had grabbed my hand. She's sobbing because she cries when she's mad. I'm terrified. I'm shaking. The only time I've ever been to court was to watch my mom's parental rights get taken away. So yeah, I was terrified. But John walks in with his attorney, and I know this is not going to go well. I've got very little memory of the interaction between John and his attorney and the judge. All I remember is the one word I kept hearing the judge say was, we're going to reschedule this because this is like a Zamboni. This is not a level playing field. you need to get an attorney. I had no idea what a Zamboni was, but he told me I needed to get an attorney.
Yes.
And then I don't know why you got so mad and we had to pull you down, and because you literally popped up like the bailiff was going to come get you.
My memory of that is the Zamboni reference was that he said we need to level the playing field.
Okay.
It's not fair. So the Zamboni clears the ice.
Right.
So him having a lawyer and you not, he wanted to level the playing field. It was actually to your benefit. So it was a good judge. It was a good decision that day. The thing that had really ticked me off is he showed up at the last minute, sauntered in, and then his attorney was belittling, was basically saying,
I was overreacting.
Little lady, she's overreacting. Yeah, methinks
thou
protest too much.
Yeah,
The Shakespeare
quote. Yeah.
He put that in the
actual paperwork.
rebuttal. Yeah,
right.
Paperwork, whatever you want to call that. And was even more condescending when he got up there. So everyone had exited the room for the most part.
And the judge said, go get an attorney,
yes.
Come back December 2nd.
Yes.
And John had to wait while I followed the attorney and the bailiff out to the judge's chambers to get the date. So you were in. I
don't know what made me, other than all of
the smirk
above.
On his face, I remember you saying.
He went by, yes, and I think he smirked and I jumped up because I had it. I'd had it. And yes, Bootsy, Chris, everybody was pulling me down. Chris offered to see me in jail if I ended up in jail.
And Mama Bootsy said, I'm claustrophobic, so I'm not coming to see you. I can't come
to see you.
Yeah.
I was just so angry. I was so angry because we had just gotten through so much and he had no idea. And I was ticked.
Yeah. And only love can produce that kind of anger for somebody that you didn't know for a long time. And so I know that this is a friendship that the Lord put together. And I remember laughing about that. And I remember Mama Bootsy saying she wouldn't come see you. And so court was rescheduled by that time.
Yes.
I was going back to work. And the way I remember that restraining order going down, so that temporary restraining order, because I'm going to end this on another hallmark of PTSD, which is silence, because I got silenced in this situation. And so the court date came, and you were kind enough to lend me money to hire an attorney, and the attorney was willing to go to bat. And I can't remember whether John broke the restraining order, but somehow he got through to me and said, please don't do this. And so I dropped it.
Yeah.
Tell the people from your perspective why you think I dropped it.
I think that when someone who is supposed to love you, who's taken a vow before God to love you, has harmed you, it makes you question your own value. And in that moment, I think it might have been a last-ditch effort to make him see you as valuable, precious.
All the things he had not.
Exactly.
seen.
Because you were giving him, it was more than just dropping a restraining order. He said, I can't get a job. I'm going to lose everything.
I can't find somewhere to live.
You had an opportunity to give him everything, basically. You held all the cards.
Hearing you explain it like that is really like, if I can do something in that case, like you were talking about, I was able to do something for John in terms of he was making it very clear that he couldn't get a job and that he didn't have anywhere to live. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I don't know that I would have answered it that way. One of the reasons why I do the behind the mic video is because I want people hearing the difficult things on the podcast. And you hear my voice, it sounds like, hey, she's great. I want them to see the healing that's occurred. But you've had a front row seat of all of it. In particular, you've had a front row seat of this issue of value.
It is the first battle. Am I lovable? Is there something wrong with me? I don't know that you know that that's the target that is the biggest bullseye for Satan.
Right. Yeah, because he doesn't want me to know who I am or my value in Christ as an image bearer.
Correct.
Or just because I exist, right?
Because you exist.
We as human beings are created for community. We're created to be heard and to be known and to be seen and to be valued. If you would have asked me that question, why do you think you would drop the restraining order? Because it's approach avoidance. I don't like conflict. But I do think at its core it was value. And it was one last-ditch effort for me to say to John by my actions, I love you and I forgive you, and hoping that he would move on. But value is something that might be something that I fight for the rest of my life.
I wonder if it is something that we all will fight all of our lives. I don't know a lot of people who have a really, really good grasp on their value intrinsically from God.
Right.
Not from their job, not from their family, not from being a mom, a sister, just because God made you.
And Satan, to your point, this is the thing that he will attack. And he does not want us to understand that we are made in the image of God, which itself is valuable, period, in the discussion.
Period. Yeah.
And so, this is a hallmark of the human condition, really. Value is the last thing that we pay attention to, and it should be the first, because it's the only way I can own who I am in Christ. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up. Let's talk a little bit more about the reality of flashbacks and night terrors. Probably the most prevalent hallmark of post-traumatic stress disorder. You're unable to differentiate between time and space. And so I would wake up, and sometimes still do, wake up, and it's 1978 in that dark room with that serial killer abusing me.
Right.
And when you're in the early parts of healing a post-traumatic stress disorder, I was unable to say it's 2008. I'm at Crissy's house in Clearwater, Florida. I'm 36 years old. I'm safe. I know that you were hearing me, or somehow you knew I was having PTSD. I was having flashbacks. I don't know that we knew what they were. And the hospital had diagnosed me with PTSD, but I still didn't believe them. I asked Dr. Pettit years later.
I understood it. At this point, I'm cluing in.
So I'm in denial.
So you're still in denial. I'm cluing in, and I'm talking with Dr.
Are you
Pettit.
Researching? So you're talking to Dr. Pettit?
I'm talking to Dr. Pettit about it and trying to understand flashbacks. How do I help, and those types of things. And so I started out with my door open, and it was a split design, the house was. And so we were across the house from each other, but I left my door open to listen for you to go help. And then I ended up in the living room to try to be closer so I could hop up and help. And by the end of it, I ended up in your room. There was a recliner in that room, and there was just no way for you to heal without somebody literally there. There was just too many years of trauma. At the point I met you, it was really 35 years of pretty solid
31 days or 31 years of trauma.
Right. So there, and you had hit a rock wall by the time you had gone to the hospital. And so we were in the middle of you dealing with it. I'm not saying that every situation is going to call for
somebody being in the room.
However, if your child has recently been harmed,
right,
it's highly likely this may be your solution.
Certainly. And my case is there's more trauma than normal. I also want to know, for people who are listening, clearly you leaned on the Lord. Clearly you leaned on the wisdom of your mom. But what other, and Dr. Pettit,
yes,
who kept it real for you.
Yes.
At one point, Dr. Pettit said to you, Crissy, I only want her to have to breathe, eat, and hydrate.
But your job was only to breathe. My job was to help you eat, to hydrate you, to do your laundry, to gas up your car, to take you places. Literally at that point, it was life and death.
Yeah, 100%.
We were at that point. It was an extreme situation and called for extreme measures, which meant your brain was so taxed that literally to get everything to calm down, the requirement was, hey, her job is just to breathe. Just keep breathing. And so I was able to do that. I mean, that's for me, that's
Well,
easy.
You've been preparing your whole life for that.
Right. So I did everything else.
Yeah.
And that was fine.
Were you leaning on people in our life group?
I would say that one of the hard things in these situations is still the silence on my part. I didn't feel like there were a lot of safe places for me to share.
Wow, that's good.
And
I mean, that's not good, but that's a good word.
Yeah, I think that it's not easy stuff to talk about. It wasn't mine to share.
Right.
So I had a big problem. I couldn't share your story without your permission, and at that point, I didn't have your permission. You didn't want, clearly, to go blast out to everybody what was going on. You were barely making it. You were just breathing.
Were you ever scared that I was not going to make it?
Absolutely. Every day I assumed for the first, and honestly, I would say the first year of our friendship, so post hospitalization, that next year, every day, I assumed that you would not make it. I assumed that this was a gift, that I had a short-term friendship with you, and that the Lord had given me a moment with you, and that it would be very short-lived. Wow. I did not think he would make it.
And, looking you in the eye, which of course they can't see, but looking you in the eye, that's hard. And the first words that I wanted to say were, I'm sorry. But what I am going to say is thank you. Perhaps one of the coolest things about doing this podcast is experiencing conversations like Crissy and I are having, and you are actually getting to hear. It was a conversation where we sat down and really just tried to organically chat through some of these things that both of us have been through in this journey with PTSD. What's so cool about it is to actually see personal growth, whereas I'm able to thank Crissy for helping me instead of apologizing or feeling like I need to overcompensate for it. We mentioned value quite a bit at the end of this podcast, and that is something that we will probably devote an entire podcast to. But Crissy's answer to that question was interesting to me, and my response at first would have been a response of a couple years ago, where I apologized for putting her through some of the things that she walked with me. But instead, I got healthy enough to thank her for walking with me through it. I got healthy enough to thank her for continuing to remind me of my value, and I'd like to remind you of yours too. Next week will be the last and final podcast where Crissy joins us, at least for now. We would love it if you would follow us on all social media. Twitter and Facebook are Amy Watson Author, and Instagram is Author Amy Watson. Would also be honored if, when you listen to the podcast, if you will throw us a review or at least give us some stars so that we continue to be respected on the podcast platforms. As always, you can get in touch with me through my website, amywatsonauthor.com, and we look forward to spending some more time with you 2 weeks from today.